Well, I want to welcome everyone to today's episode. I'm very excited for what we're going to get into today. It's going to be the topic of emotional gaslighting. And it's very curious, when we think of in faith communities, the lingo for different things around, manipulation or coercion and so forth like that can kind of get hushed in faith communities, and a lot of times in faith communities, we just make the priority growing in our faith, or the goal is to grow in our Bible knowledge or whatever may have you. And all of those things are very good. The shadow side of being in community is that you have to deal with the dark side of what happens when human beings just kind of get out of whack. And one of the things we can do is we can what's called gaslight. And I'm really looking forward to an expert that we have. It is a psychologist, Dr. Foluso. She is someone who I'm very excited about. We're going to be doing two parts, actually. We're going to do this episode, which is gaslighting. And the next episode is going to be religiosity and OCD, or religious scrupulosity. And I am really excited because there's a lot of people who have reached out and either done polls on my Patreon audience and so forth and wanted someone who is skillful at talking about these very delicate subjects. So without further ado, Dr. Foluso, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Kyle. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey as it relates to your faith and then your journey into becoming a psychologist?
Okay. Well, I'm a born again Christian. I was, raised in a Christian home, and one of those people that, just kind of has been a Christian as long as I can remember. And so that's been my, my pretty much my journey, as a Christian. I think as I got deeper in the faith, I was really, before I even became a psychologist, I was always interested in the relationship between faith and mental health. And I knew that whatever profession that I went into, that I really wanted to integrate my Christian beliefs and make sure that people were well served, administered to in whatever I did. And so I decided to become a psychologist. I think I had done some sort of, I think, internship with a psychiatrist. And at this time, right now, psychiatrists primarily prescribe medication, but this psychiatrist did both. So he did talk therapy and he did medication management as well. So sometimes he would have me sit in the talk therapy sessions and help him, transcribe and whatever. And it was really interesting to see how clients responded differently to talk therapy. And I became interested in that mind body connection, but more so, the mind and how people transform through therapy. And so that was how I decided to go ahead and get my doctorate in clinical psychology. So I am a licensed psychologist. And so that's what I do. I love what I do. And I even noticed when we talk about the faith journey that while I was studying and even practicing, there seemed to be this, I would say, stigma in the church around people getting mental health services, right? And so we think about, as Christians, we're supposed to be, it wasn't necessarily on the cutting edge, but we want to do everything with excellence. And I just noticed that people seem to be suffering needlessly from mental health concerns because of the stigma around receiving mental health.
Mm-hmm.
So it was when people were getting counseling, it was one of those, read two verses and call me in the morning. I remember someone literally saying that they went to, this is not to bash Christian counselors at all. They're wonderful counselors in every faith, or not every faith, but just everywhere. So this is not a slam on Christian counselors, but people would talk about being given, just a list of Bible verses to read. And so people were really struggling with, yes, I'm a Christian. I believe I'm a Christian, but then there are these experiences that are not supposed to be a part of my faith journey, feeling a lot of shame. The shame is preventing them from getting the services they need. And so when I experienced that, it really gave me a passion to serve people like this and help them understand that, God gives us knowledge in all arenas, including, mental health, and how can we use that appropriately to relieve people from suffering and just help them get more emotionally healthy.
Mm. Yeah, I love that intersect that you decided to enter. And it's a hard intersect. When you think about the idea of psychology, as you'd mentioned in the church, and I say across Christendom, so to speak,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of quote unquote humanism that triggers pastors or people who are trying to live by God's word, or they feel like all of psychology is sort of just humanistic. And the reality is I
Yes.
love kind of what you said, which is in some ways truth belongs to God. And
Yeah.
so there are times where we get some major truth as it relates to clinical findings and how people work. And I mean, we see it with on the physical side with diabetes or with heart disease, and
Yes.
it's fine for Christians to lower their blood pressure, right? That's good. But it's
Yes.
also helpful to use psychological metrics and so forth to lower their anxiety or their depression, because we know that that's a killer for people as
Yes.
well. Okay, so gaslighting is a term that's used very frequently. And
Yes.
I really want to give people good definitions. I think there's a lot of rhetoric out there,
Hmm.
and it's toned up. We kind of, in some ways, need to tone it down and get solid on good definitions. I think a lot of
Yeah.
people either we use Siri or we use Google. I've done it. Wikipedia done it. YouTube done it. Um,
Yeah.
but we use these different methods to try to get information, and it's really easy to be led into a wrong definition. And so, um, what is gaslighting? How do you define it? And we'll just start there. How do you define gaslighting?
So gaslighting, and I agree with what you said about this, that it's not a necessarily a clinical term. It is more of a pop psych term.
Mm,
However, it has a lot of validity. I'm going to explain why. No, so gaslighting is when somebody attempts to it's a form of emotional control and a form of manipulation. And this is when someone else, and it's an erosive process. So I also want to, if someone, two people disagree, or someone lies to you purposefully, that's not gaslighting. Gaslighting is an erosive process that is emotional manipulation that tries to get the person who is gaslighting the other person to get them to deny or doubt their perception of reality,
mm,
right? And so it is, and the reason it is emotional control or manipulation is because it's one person attempting to hijack the will of the other person, hijack their perception, hijack or control their um, their competence, right, or their perception of their competence. And so the term gaslighting actually comes from an old movie
mm,
called Gaslight, in which a woman was married to an emotionally abusive man, and he would go in the attic to change the turn down the gas, which would affect the lights. And so she thought she was going crazy because she would see the lights flickering, and he would say, oh, there's nothing happening. And so because she was not believing her own perception and believing that she was going crazy. She was the one that looked like she was not in her right faculties, whereas he was the one that manipulating the whole situation. And so that's what gaslighting is. It's not, we talked about, you said this before, that it's not, it's not a lot of things. So if two people disagree, let's say you and I have a difference of opinion regarding politics, and you say, well, I'm right, and I say, well, I'm right. That's not, you're not, no one's gaslighting anybody else. But if you say to me something along the lines of, well, all people that think that way must be crazy, or you somehow attack my ability, or you act in such a way where I feel that I cannot trust my own perceptions or trust my own reality. That is what gaslighting is. So an example is, let's say somebody comes, they talk to their spouse or their partner about being upset about something that they did, and the person says, well, you're just too sensitive.
mm,
It's really not that big a deal. But they do this repeatedly, right? So over time, that person feels uncomfortable bringing up a situation because their reality is being doubted by the other person. So being told, oh, you're just too sensitive. There are other examples. So for instance, when somebody could say something, well, how could you think that way, and just look at the person, right? Or how would anybody come to that type of conclusion? That's crazy, that's weird. And so what ends up happening over time is that person who's being gaslit starts to doubt whether they are actually seeing things as they are. So they wonder, am I seeing things correctly? Am I perceiving things correctly? They doubt their competence. They may say something to themselves like, well, maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I always look for the worst in people. Another a not commonly known form of gaslighting is when someone is deliberately being two-faced. And
mm,
so someone talked about a situation where they went through spiritual abuse from a pastor, And they said that this pastor was the most charming person from the pulpit, was very kind to everybody, fun, just they had a very magnetic personality. But when this individual met with the pastor behind closed doors, the pastor was verbally abusive to them, would threaten them. And so what would end up happening is if this person ever brought up their concerns about how they're being treated by the pastor, how's anybody going to believe them when they never see that face of the pastor? Do you see what I mean? And I understand that we can all be different at times. We may be more comfortable around our family, but gaslighting is purposeful, it's erosive, it's a way of getting control over somebody else. And so when someone is deliberately one face in public and then being a stark different person behind closed doors, it's very difficult for the person who's being emotionally abused or being abused any other way to be believed, because no one sees the face of the no one sees this abusive tormentor behind closed doors. And so it's really important to remember that the gaslighting is as a subversive, you know sort of control. No one's going to tell someone, hey, you have to think just the way I think. What they do is they just begin to plant seeds of doubt over and over a period of time to erode at that person's confidence and perception of their own reality.
Wow. So a couple things here that I'm really kind of hearing from you is that um, in some ways gaslighting is this kind of thing where like the other person is made to be out to be crazy, like they're the
Yeah,
crazy ones,
yeah.
and it's them that's the problem. And so what's crazy about that is, well, I'm kind of wanting to go to my wife and be like, do I do this to you? And I don't mean that from a perspective that I think I'm this, but like, to be honest, like I think sometimes we all have ways of doing things, and especially in like the caring fields like we're in, we're kind of
Yeah.
like the mental know-it-alls at times, and I think even we have to be careful.
That's very true. It happens too in professions. I also want to piggyback on what you said,
Yeah.
because people have talked about how they've been medically gaslit. An important component of gaslighting is the assumption, we tend to want to believe the best of people, especially in spiritual settings. If we talk about, or just in general, no one being described as a suspicious person or someone who is cautious is less is not valued as well as someone who maybe believes the best and wants to believe that people are good. We tend to believe that people who are in helping professions, especially, know what they're talking about. Or they wouldn't harm me. My pastor wouldn't harm me. My doctor or my therapist wouldn't harm me. So that assumption of benevolence makes us more vulnerable to gaslighting, and that happens to people, who have medical concerns, maybe some of these chronic conditions over time. The doctor will just tell them, oh, you're just stressed out. It's all in your head, things like that. So I just wanted to, because you touched on a very good point. And
Yeah.
oftentimes gaslighting can happen when there's a power differential
Yeah,
in
and
their
that's
perception.
the big thing I really heard from you in that was there's an aspect of there's a serious lack of safety. And kind of the way I define safety is about how power gets used. So
Yeah.
to me, this is incredibly sinister when there's, to your point, a power differential, and one person who has more knowledge, or they have more experience, or they've got a position, can really take advantage of someone else, and their understanding of reality can really get warped. And in a clinical
Yeah.
setting, and I know you know this really, really well, but with my clients, when I have folks come in, or even in ministry sense, it really, and this kind of goes to the other part, is why is it so damaging and why is it so manipulative? It When you get in there and you start pulling the little puppet strings in people's minds, it creates
Yes.
like long-term issues. And I find that even like
Right.
with some of my clients, there's a deep sense of self-mistrust. And I,
Yes.
I don't mean self in terms of like the part of us that is self-willed and disobedient. I mean self in terms of the healthy part that God has renewed. And so now a person doesn't trust their own voice, they don't trust their gut. And now
Yeah.
that's really, so anyway, what in your mind is so damaging about gaslighting from your experience?
Well, you touched on a lot of it, Kyle. Is what you talked about is not being able to trust self and our God-given perceptions, right? In the Bible, it talks about
Mm,
discernment. It talks about how in Proverbs, the wise person sees danger and they run, right?
mm,
when people are continually gaslit, they form an unhealthy dependence on others because they think, well, there's no way I can know this for myself. I can't tell when I'm in danger. They're always, it is just mentally exhausting because they're always doubting themselves, right?
Wow.
They'll say, and then when they doubt themselves and maybe they, as a result, were maybe in a harmful situation, then they blame themselves. So it's just a vicious cycle: self doubt, self blame, inability to trust oneself, especially when we think about spiritual situations. Believing that, well, God can't speak to me. God, I when I read the Bible, maybe if I think this, or if I believe good things about myself, it must be bad, or I can't trust myself. It's basically not being able to trust in the very things you see. So they could
Wow.
see something that's harmful and think, well, I'm just a overly critical person, or I'm just too sensitive, or I'm this, so whatever I saw was not real, right? And so it's a tug of war, because in one sense your body may be telling you, oh, this is wrong, run away, or you're in danger, but then your mind is telling you, because of this process of gaslighting, well, I can't trust myself. There's a lot of shame. And even too, when people have been in a situation where they've been continually gaslit, they may react in a way that makes them look perhaps unstable, right? And so if we see a
Mm.
situation where there's marriage counseling or something like that, and you'll see a couple, one spouse is gaslighting the other, and so the one who's being gaslit may overreact, right? Or just maybe be a point where they've had it, and then they look to everyone else like they're the crazy, emotionally unstable one, and the gaslighting spouse is saying, see, well, I told you, they can't do this, or look at how they are. And so it just further builds into that cycle of self shame or shame and self doubt. And so,
There's a couple things that you said are God given discernment. I love your phraseology, by the way. You articulate yourself so well as it relates to
thank
this
you.
subject, and just even the way I think. I think I hear myself so much. Someone else says it better. It's like, oh, I wish I would have said it that way. Anyway, I really
Thank you.
appreciate the way you're saying this. There's a couple of things that even scripturally that stick out to me, and I'm really glad that you kind of even talked about, just again, God gives us discernment. So I think of Jesus. Jesus comes along, and his big sort of polemic is against these leaders who are taking advantage of the people. And one of the things he tells the people is, he says, by their fruit you will recognize them. So even in that, because I would have to imagine the power differential between the Jewish leaders and the Jewish members. I mean, it's pretty
Yeah.
wide as far as the gap. But Jesus comes in and restores people's sanity as it relates to spiritual vision, spiritual sight. And here's
Yes.
what you look for. You look for the fruit. And
Yes.
and I'm like, wow, so that piece. And then the other part that Jesus does, as you were talking, I'm like, oh my goodness, this Jesus is trying to help with gaslighting, is he talks about there's the outside of the cup, and then you have the inside of the cup. And
Yes.
so it feels like the manipulative part of gaslighting is presenting yourself as clean when your motives are dirty. and
Oh, that's good. Yes.
and so it's just kind of interesting to me, because it's like Jesus has something to say about this too, it seems.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. That is spot on. And we are all told that we should look at people's fruit, but sometimes we will hear it. You will hear, especially within the Christian community, well, don't judge, right? So if you point out
Mm,
anything wrong or anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, you're judging. You're causing a spirit of you have a critical spirit. You're causing division. It's basically the misuse of scripture. And so that can happen. People who have been in situations like this, again, are taught to look the other way in the name of keeping the peace or keeping unity. And
unity. Mm,
God tells us to look for fruit, right? He gives us the power to make decisions and to judge. I mean, all the time, to judge appropriately. The Bible doesn't tell us never to judge. It tells us how to do so and in what ways. And so it's really important that we have agency as believers. And it's in any time, if you think about feeling a telltale sign of gaslighting is just when someone when you feel like someone is trying to take away your ability to choose or your ability to see in an emotional situation. It's a subversive or a coercive form of control, right? And also another thing that happens a lot in these situations, especially within not just Christian circles, but any other circle, is called a spiritual bypass, right? And so when someone is bringing up something, a spiritual bypass could be something like, oh, well, you don't have enough faith, or you don't have enough love and light. We think about sort of like what's going on with the new age movement and manifestation. We hear a lot of that. Well, you didn't manifest correctly, you thought a lot of bad things, and this is why this happened to you. So it is really, it is so when people do the spiritual bypass thing, they don't even address the root of the issue, right? Someone may bring a complaint against a leader, and they'll take a scripture and use it against them, or say, well, you just are always, because you have a bad heart, you always see the bad in people. It's not addressing the issue, it's using spirituality to bypass it. And so when you think about people that use spiritual phrases and use these, lofty terms and verses, it sounds good right on the outside, but we're not addressing the issue. So that's really important. Spiritual bypass happens not just in Christian circles, but all other sorts of religious community as well. Just basically using spirituality to go right around the issue and make you feel like you're not seeing what you're seeing.
It's interesting you bring this up, and I think this is a great transition to our next question. I think of Job's friends. So I was reading through Job this year, and the thing about Job's friends brought up really good spiritual insights, but their application was horrible. So
Yeah.
what they did with Job is they basically blamed him for what he was going through. Now,
Yes.
what they did is they brought up spiritual principles, and there was kind of this understanding of humility, and there was this understanding of being pious, right? It was kind of that one interview, something about the pious bias, and so it's like this idea of Job is literally, and they do a good job for like the first couple days where they sit with him and don't say
Yeah.
anything. They were doing great,
Yeah.
and then they
Yeah.
stopped doing that.
Sure. Yep.
And then they started throwing out all of these assertions and all these different, well, it's maybe this and maybe this and maybe this, and toward the end God rebukes them and all of
Yes.
their spiritual insights, and they know what they're and it's just kind of amazing, because it's like, well, Job was actually never given the reason. Job
Yeah.
was never given the reason for why he went through what he went through. There was a reason, but God never told him what it was. Regardless, the whole point of it all was that Job was supposed to have complete freedom of expression of his pain and his relationship with God. And God did not want for Job to censor himself. Now, let's just say Job's friends are not comfortable with that level of intimacy, or they kind of start judging Job or whatever, and they start saying it is what it is. So I guess what I'm saying, that it just feels like a use case scenario. It's like Job's friends, as we even talk about kind of like gaslighting amongst Christians. That may not be where you were going to go. You go wherever you want. But that's kind of what came to mind for me.
Oh, definitely. It definitely, blaming the person for whatever situation they're in is, when we think about these sorts of situations where, like you talked about with Job, with anybody, using spirituality as a way of just masking things, not addressing the root of the issue, like his friends did. I mean, they said, you're the one to blame here for all of this, and if you, maybe you sinned, maybe you did this, and people who gaslight can operate in similar matters, even misusing. Something you touched on that was very important was the application of scripture, right? And so somebody, who is, maybe experiencing trauma, depression, PTSD, or something like that, they're told, well, you know what, the joy of the Lord is your strength. And so now they are experiencing real mental health symptoms, and they may be related to physical issues as well, but they can't, they're looking at it like, well, maybe it's a moral failure, right? And with some of these things, and I mean, moral issues can, they can relate to or even cause some mental health concerns, but to say this is the reason, this is why that's happening, it makes the person take the focus put the focus on the wrong thing, right? I think of it like that, that
Hmm.
they're, so that they're looking at, anytime something happens, it's relationships are two directional. They're
Hmm.
bi-directional, right? And so if you think about a situation where someone brings up like some sort of like abuse or some sort of mistreatment, someone who is gaslighting will oftentimes take the agency and the accountability away from the person who was doing the abusing. So, well,
Wow.
you're in this situation because of something you did, or you're seeing things the wrong way. It's just it's very malicious, and it's very, because especially in spiritual circles, because people can hide behind spirituality, it makes it even more pernicious, because now you're in a situation where you're questioning a spiritual authority. And sometimes for people, they feel like, where else am I going to go now? Even
Hmm.
my own spirituality, my own faith isn't real, isn't valid. And so it's just especially dangerous when it happens in spiritual communities.
Oh, mercy. It's interesting. I think one of the things, there's two things. I'm wondering in the way you've looked at people, and when you've actually counseled people who have been, traumatized and gaslit, and because it is traumatizing to be gaslit over. It can be one incident, it could be chronic,
Yeah.
over a period of time. Um, there's almost an aspect of grooming that seems associated
Yes,
with gaslighting. But
definitely.
it seems. Have you noticed that people have come in sort of infantilized?
Yes. Looking, it's almost like this need, like I need someone to tell me what to do. I need someone to show me how to believe or how to process my faith because I can't trust myself. So when people experience gaslighting, they also do it to themselves, right? You can gaslight yourself, and so you can see something, see a situation that bothers you, that makes you feel uncomfortable, and say, well, you know what? My perception's bad. I have a
Wow.
sinful and deceitful heart. I'm too critical, and just ignore what you think you saw, or what makes you feel uncomfortable, or it must be my fault. I didn't, it's my fault, it's my perception. And then also what happens over time is that people believe that they they are not capable of making the right decisions and perceiving. So so it makes them more susceptible to strict controlling figures, because they're like, well, I can't make that decision for myself. So, back in Christian circles, that these things tend to come up. There was something like in, I think, around the 70s, called like the shepherding movement, where people were they would go to, pastors would have to give them the green light to get married, to buy homes. It was this whole thing of a spiritual covering. And so the basis of that was, well, we can't make decisions on our own, so we have to go to this pastor or this pastor, and they will tell us what to do. Now, getting pastoral counseling or advice, there's nothing wrong with that. It's encouraged. I would encourage, from the right sources, to do that. But when that person takes control, that's not good. We were never meant to have dominion over one another. God gave Adam and
Right.
Eve dominion over the animals, but not over one another. God gave us free will, and there are consequences to what we do, but there are authority figures that he puts there, but there's a difference between authority and dominion/control. And when you talk about that infantilization, it comes as it's that end result of that erosive process, where people are just told, well, I can't trust what I see. And we also see a lot of somatization with that. What I mean by somatization is physical symptoms, so like a lot of stomach aches, a lot of headaches, because it's difficult to express. I mean, imagine someone saying, I feel angry, and then they're told, no, 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 anger is wrong. You can't feel
Mm.
angry. You either can feel angry, you can be a horrible sinner and bad person because you've expressed anger about something unfair that happened to you, right? And so a lot of times when people are in these situations repeatedly, they just bury those emotions. And you and I know this, as mental health practitioners, those emotions don't go away. They're going to come out in some form or another. So when I see things like unexplained headaches, body pains that have real roots, but it's a lot of it is just that difficulty in expressing oneself. Another form of gaslighting is kind of this thing we talk about with toxic positivity, right? And so
Yeah.
when people are expressing real pain, real trauma, well, God doesn't want us to live in the past, or things will, yeah, things will get better soon. Stop being so negative. It's this, you have to speak life into this situation. We hear these catchphrases a lot in Christianity, and on the surface they're not bad, but God, if you read the book of Psalms, I mean, David expressed the range of emotions, and there is a health there that is, God knows what we're feeling already. So to sort of just shut that down and tell people, well, this is how we must feel. It's an oversimplification of what someone is going through, and just saying, well, we'll feel better soon. There are people that are worse off than you. I'm sure, just, what I mean by that. Just
Yep.
these platitudes, these very simple oversimplification
Hmm.
of challenging things that we go through, and it's in the name of being positive, but it can be toxic because you're invalidating what someone else is going through.
For our listeners, for a moment, I can never sort of truly speculate why someone's doing something. Like, I think judgment starts with thinking we know what's in someone else's heart. So I can't claim to know what's in someone else's heart, but I can tell you this:
Mhm.
if somebody's gaslighting, that there's something in them. We talk about
Mhm.
USA feelings, which is uncomfortable, scary, and awkward feelings. Typically, when we get filled with those feelings, we typically try to reduce something on the outside. So if, let's
Yeah.
say I'm dealing with you and we're talking and you bring up pain that I'm not good at managing. Let's say you bring up anger versus sadness, and I'm better with one versus the other, and I do a shutdown with your sadness or I do a shutdown with your anger. That's actually about me.
Yeah.
So, and this is kind of, I think, we start trying to force culture on people. So I actually, because when you had talked about the shepherding movement, many of my listeners, we have, many of, including myself, have, through faith and um, through really trying to be moldable and impressionable, so to speak, and be humble. That's probably the best way to put it. You get a lot of advice, or you
Mhm.
submit yourself to a culture because you just love Christ, and
Yeah.
you're like, you know what? I'm just so happy to be saved. So there's a couple of like things that I see that in addition to that. So I love that you talked about catchphrases, toxic positivity, love bombing. I want to throw that one in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Sometimes one of the catchphrases is be giving. Like, oh, you're just in yourself. You need to. Here's another one: get out of yourself.
Mhm.
Let's say someone comes in, like in our specific culture, we have a hugging culture. Like back in the day, it used to be a holy kiss. Well, I'm starting to realize, culturally speaking, if you try to force hugs on people, like there was a young lady who used to really not do hugs.
Mhm.
And I remember, I hate to say this, but I think I was a casualty of the culture as well, because it was kind of like, if you don't want to get a hug, give a hug, you're being selfish. You're not being giving. You're not being out of yourself. Well, she had been through horrible trauma, I believe. And that trauma, and so what's amazing is, guess what? Over like time, maybe 5+ years, she now
Mhm.
hugs, but it's taken time.
Yeah.
And that would be one of those things where you could easily gaslight somebody who's very vulnerable. Now, I never made it or gave me a hug or anything, or I never
Yeah.
pressure. But the point is that we create cultures that can re-traumatize people, and then, like with
Very.
evangelizing. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this. When we are young, we have this stranger danger thing. Well, when we're young, like my son's 2.5, almost 3 next month. So he's basically 3. We're teaching him you don't talk to strangers. Well, when you become a Christian, what are you supposed to do? Talk to strangers. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering, as a psychologist, can you just help us out with, we get these deep wirings, this pretty deep circuitry, and then we come to this culture that's like really trying to grow people and push people and get out of yourself. And some people, let's just say, it may take a little more time because they got damaged a certain way. And so what when you look at church culture, what are some encouragements you have for just kind of helping people to be a little bit more conscientious?
So I think just in terms of not gaslighting other people, respecting that, respecting that people, can say no, right? And understanding that when did we can ask people certain things, but we don't have the right to demand things of one another. And I think that because
Mm,
we're in this church setting, we tend to sometimes to our detriment, believe the best, right, about people. We assume benevolence. We give trust when it should be earned, right? And trust not only
mm,
should be earned, but it needs to be maintained over time, right? And so
wow.
people can lose our trust, and that is okay. So understanding that people like give people space, give people boundaries, even in terms of touch. We talk about things with children, and and just even how we relate to children, how we relate to other people, just respecting people's agency, right? And if we think about leadership, leading from a servant leader model, like what Jesus Christ did. He didn't come to lord anything over anybody.
Right.
He came to serve. So I think if we look at that as how can we serve the needs of other people around us instead of trying to demand or extract or force our will or our way of thinking, that's a good one. Also, like you talked about with the USA, right? Uncomfortable, scared, angry. A lot of times Christians, it surprises me and saddens me just the levels of emotional dysfunction I see in the church. And again, I love the church, but we have to call things out when we see it. And so sometimes Christians have a really difficult time managing and acknowledging their own difficult emotions, right? Things like
Mm,
grieving. We don't allow time to mourn or grieve. So countless people have told me about how they've lost loved ones, and they've been told by people in the church, well, get over it. They're in heaven now, right? Why are you mourning about this? And a lot of times when I see the types of people that do this, I know that we can't judge and we don't know the inner motives, but I see a lot of times that people have difficulty, like you said, with their own challenging emotions. So when they see that right in front of them, they don't know how to deal with that. And so part of it is just acknowledging that as Christians and as human beings, we're going to experience a wide range of challenging emotions, helping our kids understand that, and other people around us, that look, the emotion itself is not the problem, it's how we handle it,
mm-hmm.
right? And so that is very important. And then also just creating safe spaces within church for for certain things, so not using manipulation and to try and get people to do things, like asking people on the spot, well, I need you to volunteer for this, can you do it? But understanding that people need time to make a decision, right? Or even things like within the prophecy movements and using prophetic words. I can't tell you how many people have talked to me about how they've been gaslit and controlled with prophecy, right? And so
Wow.
and we have to be very careful. Anytime someone assumes to speak on behalf of God, you're going to be, that's not something to play around with. Teachers are held to higher standards, and even with using prophecy. So, in some churches that I know of, they use prophecy as a way of encouraging people. So making sure that we're saying encouraging words to other people, and not and not saying things in a way to coerce people, right? And then on the other end, in terms of us not being gaslit, um, making sure that we take time. We talked before about love bombing, right? And love bombing is a way of impression management, right?
Mm,
Sometimes people have talked about they'll go to a church and they get all this attention and time and just everything. They're made to feel like celebrities, and so when they're now asked to do something, they feel, oh, well, I can't. They gave me all these wonderful gifts, and it's not just in churches. I'm bringing up churches a lot, but even in interpersonal relationships. So asserting our right to say no, saying, I don't feel comfortable receiving this gift. I don't feel comfortable with this. Even when you say no to somebody, look at how they react. Maybe you're in, someone says, oh, I want us to do this, and you say, I'll get back to you, or no, I don't want to, and just watch what that interaction is like. Someone who is healthy, who has healthy emotions and healthy boundaries, should be able to accept your no and not try
mm,
and override that or try to go in the back door. And so it is not bad for us to wait for people to earn our trust. It's not a critical spirit. It's not, talk to God and ask God to reveal to you what you need to do. But I think that waiting and taking things slowly is really good. So that's one way that we can prevent ourselves from being in these situations. And then just simply being, just stating, well, I happen to disagree with that, or I don't think that way, and you can calmly when you feel like you have to do what someone says or you have to agree with someone, that's not healthy. That's not a good relationship. Jesus never forced his will on anybody. He told people they come follow him or they didn't. They could not follow him. But when we feel um that unction, like, oh well, I'm scared to not go along with what this person says, that's a huge red flag.
It's interesting. I ran across a term the other day, and it was like narcissist versus dark empath. And a dark empath that just really struck me, and I was like, again, anytime I read something, I really seek to apply it to me first, and I'm not trying to sort of pump myself up as this trustworthy whatever, but it scares me that, I'm human, which means
Yeah.
that I'm a part of everything we're saying, right? I need to check myself. But this idea of a dark empath is so sinister in my mind, because when you get people who are very charismatic, people who get what people hunger and thirst for, our emotional appetites and so forth, can be fed by these people. A narcissist typically, they are very much inflated in their, self-aggrandizing. Just very, like, if they look in a mirror, they are a king or a queen. A dark empath, it in many ways is going to play the long game, which to me is really dangerous and really manipulative, because what they understand, and some of their goals are different. They're similar to a narcissist, but what they understand about how to get people to do what they want is a little more, at times, subtle.
Yeah.
And I just feel like when you have charismatic people who can speak to you and make you feel like you're the only person in the room,
Yeah.
okay, the grooming begins. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes people apply grooming only to sexual inappropriate types of things. Grooming to me is like sexuality, but also emotional sort of manipulation as well. And so
Oh,
I wonder in your mind, I ran across that term. Can you like validate that in some way? Have you heard of that term before? I don't know if yeah.
I have, and I think, I have heard of, that dark empath term, and I think the important thing to remember is that, that I like what you said first about examining ourselves, right? Because anybody can be the recipient of spirit, of abuse or gaslighting, but you can also do that to other people. So the important thing is that we, with the X Files, and that I want to believe, right?
Yeah.
And so think about it from this perspective, that when someone is telling you something, you take the approach of, I want to believe where they're coming from. I want to see their perspective. We are all guilty at times of, emotionally invalidating people or writing them off, even from the best intentions. I think about maybe a situation, a parent with a child, and the child is like, oh, I'm so upset that I failed this. And you say, oh, don't be upset. And, you're not trying to hijack their emotional experience at that point in time. At least I would hope not. Most good enough and well-meaning parents just want to soothe their child, but
Mm,
we really want to be able to take that step back and say, I want to understand what this person's experience is right now and acknowledge what their perspective is, right? So we have
mm,
our perspective, we have their perspective, and it's not saying that the truth doesn't exist, but we can see things from different points of view. And so I think that, so that's one way that we can, like we talked about, examining yourself and making sure that we don't do these sorts of things. And then also, when you talk about that grooming process, it's very important to understand that when people do these things, it can be calculated. We like to have this
mm.
idea or myth of, like, the people that are perpetrating this type of um, um, gaslighting and abuse are these, like, wounded bullies. We've heard of that wounded bully myth, and so we hear things. This is another form of gaslighting: hurt people, right? And it makes it almost, it takes away the agency and the choice from the person who is doing this to someone else. And they've done research to find that people who inflict this emotional abuse on other people, they will go into certain professions, like the teaching professions and the helping profession. So there are
Wow.
a group of people that do this. They go in and they have a strategy and they have a plan, because they look at themselves as, I'm number one. I'm going to get what I want, and I'm going to figure out how I'm going to do this. Now, we can't speak to everybody's motives, but the Lord tells us to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. So we have to have that that foresight and that ability to be able to see that, look, not everybody who says they're for us are for us. We have to look
Mm-hmm.
at the fruit of people's lives. And so, and another thing that you talked about too with just that grooming is this idea in the church of equating forgiveness with reconciliation, right?
Oof.
And sort of pushing or preempting that process of reconciliation when people haven't shown that they are in a position to be reconciled, right? So you can forgive somebody, but sometimes we even have situations where people are gaslit into believing that they haven't forgiven someone because they're keeping a wise and safe distance from someone who has not shown, like John said, fruit in keeping with repentance. You see what I mean? And so it's really important that I took a hermeneutics class, and it's so important that we understand, like you talked about with applying scripture. It's not just knowing the scripture, it's how you apply it, and there are systems as to how we do this. So we really need to be, in the Bible ourselves and study it for ourselves and understand it, so that when people are trying to misapply scripture, so you can take scripture and make it say whatever you want. And people often do this when they are emotionally abusing other people.
Yeah, I really, I think you hit the nail on the head. Um, I think ultimately this brings us to how do we address someone who's gaslighting us, and then what are
Right.
the important factors in healing it. And when I think of like how to address someone who is doing it, that gets really tricky. And so I let's just start there. What do you
Okay.
suggest?
So there are a few things that, there are a couple things that I talk about in my own personal work, but one is the JADE. If you think of the acronym JADE, JADE, don't justify, argue, defend, or explain. And I think about when people are gaslighting, part of what they want you to do is to get into that back and forth with them because it's draining you, right? And so if you
Mm,
could just say something, you could, and I encourage people to practice what they're going to say, right? Because when you're in that situation, when you're being gaslit, physically, physiologically, you're sort of in a fight or flight response. You're not, you feel like, oh, later you might say, I wish I had said this. You're not in a position where maybe you can think exactly of what to say. So you may say something, well, you know what? I disagree. I see it differently. This is what I saw. This is what I know. I would encourage someone to take notes as well. Document what you saw, right? If there's a
wow.
situation, I know that people sometimes when they've been in spiritually abusive situations, will almost feel like, well, did I really see that person, glare at somebody else, or did I see that person storm out of the room and call this person this name? So journaling is a really important part of this. And, some people don't like journaling, and I understand it, but even just jotting notes somewhere in your phone about what you've seen, what you've experienced is very important. So I don't recommend going into back and forth with someone because they can always say, well, I didn't do this, I didn't mean this. A lot of
Mm.
times people hide behind their motives and say, well, I didn't mean to do this. If you took it this way, that's on you, right? And so really just having a pat answer, and if you need to just walk away and leave, then do so. So that's really important. And also just the self work is being in touch with your own feelings, right? So something happened, somebody said something. How did I feel? Where did I feel it in my body, right? That's really important. Our bodies tell us a lot. How am I feeling emotionally? When you check in with yourself, that strengthens the bond between, your mind and your body, right? And so you understand, oh, this is what I'm feeling. Understand what your triggers are, maybe. So for some people, when they feel kind of backed into a corner, their go-to response may be to say something back, right? And so you might want to train yourself to just not say anything, or maybe you do the opposite and you go away and you stew. So you might say something like, I don't want to discuss this any further. I'll be happy to talk to you about this at this time. Have those rehearsed answers so that when you're in that situation, you know what to do and what to say.
If you have been emotionally manipulated, most times, whatever system you're in, some are healthier than others, but I think it's very challenging for people to be taken seriously in most situations. And what makes me sad is that there's many people who have been manipulated and bullied and hazed, and within this, like, the system is really kind of there to protect, itself, right? Because we just feel so
Yes.
loyal to it. And and that's the part that makes me the most sad, is that there's a loneliness to this. And I love what you said about, so people can get out of it really easily. I didn't mean that, right? Intentions don't sanitize impact, but we focus so much
That's good.
on
Yeah.
our intentions, and we look for that to be the cleanser. And what makes me sad partly too is that if there's a certain amount of time that's passed since a really damaging event has happened, most people aren't thinking how trauma works. Trauma has very durable effects. And so something that happens to you, at this point in time, it's not just gonna, like you were saying, Felicia, just, it's not gonna go away. It's not gonna resolve. It's not gonna metabolize on its own. And so what we can happen, and this kind of goes to the part of healing, from the inside out, we can have what's called the internalized perpetrator. So Christopher Fritchett, a religious scholar who studies trauma and really kind of literary theory in terms of, like, what we see in scriptures. It's just kind of interesting. 10,000 foot view is this idea that when we get damaged, the person who damages us kind of duplicates some form of themselves, and it gets we get infected with it. So when we think about our negative thoughts, most times, I've been doing this with my clients, it's been kind of amazing. That inner critic usually sounds like a person who damaged us. I always ask
Ah.
people with the inner critic, who does it sound like? Is it male or
Hmm.
female? Is it young or is it old? Give me some characteristics of the internalized perpetrator. The internalized perpetrator is so, as you had mentioned earlier, this idea of being pernicious, because it goes with us everywhere. And then we
Yes.
become reflexed. And we're
Yes.
carrying around this very damaged, frozen part of ourselves. And it all goes back to this person who, maybe whatever they're reenacting with you, it damaged you. And so I think that a person who damages you can sort of install some sort of programming in the way that you
Yeah.
think about yourself. Anyway, I just thought about that internalized perpetrator, and I've been working at it for myself. I've been listening to my inner critic and
Yeah.
really leaning into what my inner critic is all, ultimately how it's been programmed. So anyway, I wanted to add that in terms of the inner healing. In your
Yeah.
mind, what are some other things we should take into consideration as we're trying to heal from being gaslit?
It goes back to what you said before about a little bit about what you said before about that that inner critic, and in situations when people are being spiritually abused, gaslit, emotionally manipulated, it that type of abuse thrives on isolation, and so
Oh,
that voice, the inner critic, can be even louder, right? That is, the when people gaslight other people, they sometimes can bring in other people and say, people are worried about you, or, I wonder what so and so thinks of how you had that outburst. So that, and this is how the enemy works too, to isolate us, really. So the first part of that is real is just is is coming, and it can be very difficult. I know I'm asking a lot, but getting out of that isolation, right, and talking to other people, even as a preventive measure. Don't have all your friends or contacts in just one bubble, right? I think about a study they did on childbirth, and they found that if somebody was, a woman was going into labor and she saw just one smiling face, just one, she just needed that one smiling face, the chances of a C-section were reduced significantly. And so I think
wow.
about that, yeah, just in terms of our own spirituality, our own spiritual walk. Who's that smiling face that you can count on? Somebody who can validate your experience as you choose friends, as you meet people. Think about somebody who will just listen, like Job's friends did at the beginning when they just sat with him for 7 days and didn't say anything. Somebody who will tell you, that's not right, because when people are in systems, they tend to just accept what's going on as normal. And so if you are in a situation or a relationship or whatever sort of community, find people outside of that community that you can have a friendship with. Give yourself that courage and that permission to do other things outside wherever you are, and talk to someone. I ask myself when I work with clients, ask yourself, what are the rules of this community, right, that you're in,
Ooh.
and or this relationship, right? And rules are governed by behavior. So in a abusive gaslighting situations, criticism is unacceptable, right? So if you challenge me or you disagree with me, you are criticizing me and you're therefore ungrateful. That's those are some of the messages that people hear. Or any kind of independent thought is rebellion, or any sort of anything that maybe you do for yourself as self-care is selfishness. So if you think about what the rules are that govern your environment, and you talk to someone else and say, what do you think about this, or is this normal? They'll, no, of course, therapists, that's what we do, right? We help validate people's experience, and tell people, hey, this either, yes, this is normal, or no, it's not. But getting out of that bubble, that isolative bubble, is essential to stop this type of abuse, because people who thrive on that type of abuse, or who thrive on that type of abuse, will isolate people and make people think that any sort of dissenting opinion is not any opinion other than theirs is not valid. As someone who gaslights someone else may say, well, I know you the best, and I think you're a terrible person, or no one can love you like I can. So yeah, maybe that teacher thinks you're a great student, but they don't know you like I do. And so when people
Mm.
are gaslit like that, they have a really difficult time silencing that inner critic voice, because there may be other champions, other people that believe in them, but they think, well, they don't know me as well, they can't be right.
What resources do you recommend? I mean, I'm wondering, Dr. Diane Langberg. I've had her on before, and she's got. I was reading as I was preparing for our interview a book, uh, uh, by her, Power Abuse in the Church, and she's got a Suffering the Heart of God, I believe, or whatever. And just, I think my audience, you probably read Diane Langberg. I'm really part of why I brought, Dr. Foluso on, is to give us other resources, because this is something that it got to make sense. It seems like in a lot of Christian circles, we're not going to have a lot of publications. Like, this is probably not something people want Christians talking about, right? Or whatever. So, what are some resources you want to share with us?
Sure. So there, one book I love is Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. And they're one reason I really like this. It's not necessarily related to spiritual abuse, but it just helps you develop that healthy sense of boundaries, as a Christian, right? So, and it does not. It also works. It doesn't have to be just whether you're a Christian or not. It's just very good language. I like how the book gives you language to extricate yourself from these emotionally manipulative situations. Another book that's a bit older is, I think it's called Telling Yourself the Truth by William Backaus. He's deceased, but he's another psychologist that talks about just, he gives a lot of good role plays for things like that you can, role play scenarios, and just ways where you can just be honest with yourself and honest with others about what you do and don't want to do. I think that's really
Mm.
important to protect ourselves from gaslighting. There's a great book called Untwisting the Scriptures by Rebecca Davis, and there's several books about just how scripture has been used by people in emotionally and spiritually abusive environments to tie people up and to take away their free will and their ability to think for themselves and to listen to God. So that Untwisting Scriptures series is great. I've heard that this is also very good. I haven't read the whole book, but When Narcissism Comes to Church by Chuck Degrot.
I think I may
I
have
think
heard
this
of
is the
that
name of
one.
that. Yeah. And that looks at things more from the perspective of, the way people who are narcissistic operate in church settings. But they're different. They're different resources. I have some videos on my YouTube channel that I talk about spiritual abuse and these sorts of things as well, and just how to to give yourself that freedom to, because when we think about spiritual abuse and when we think about our own relationship to God and spirituality and our faith, it is it's, I don't want to say abstract is not the word I'm looking for, but there's certain things that we can't measure, right? You can't measure how much faith someone has. You can't
Right.
measure how good or righteous or not critical someone is. And so that can make us susceptible to I think as people, we want certainty, we want rules, we want things that are visible. So sometimes we can fall prey to situations like this because of our yearning for clarity and visibility and things like that. So we have to be comfortable and real with ourselves that there's just some uncertainty we're going to have to deal with, right? And so maybe, when we hear things like, oh, you didn't have enough faith, or you're not positive, or you're this and that, when we have a very difficult time with self-doubt and uncertainty, we can be prey to these things. So part of these resources just help us understand that uncertainty is just a part of life, right? And we have to
Mm,
strengthen our resolve and restructure our relationship with uncertainty so um,
mm,
we're not susceptible to these forms of manipulation, like you talked about with that, and with that neediness and that dependence to have someone tell us what to do or tell us what to think. And so those are, the things that I talked about before, doing journaling, just allowing ourselves to feel and process challenging emotions. Of course, getting therapeutic help, getting therapy. I mean, this isn't a substitute for therapy, what we're talking about, but finding a good qualified professional that you can process these challenging emotions with is very helpful too.
one of the things I'm lamenting right now, so I want everyone who's watching this to literally go to her YouTube channel, and I want you to hit subscribe. I should have mentioned this
Thank
earlier.
you.
I've watched some of your videos, and I think you do a really good job. One of the things I think people need is they just need someone who understands and someone who's willing to talk about it, who's qualified. I think we've had a lot of people be faux qualified, or they're just qualified, through their own sort of lens or whatever. And I think we have to sort of raise the standards. And I think a really good way to take the journey further, I'm going to give you a plug, is to go and subscribe to your YouTube channel. Your YouTube channel is called Skill Set Counseling, right?
Yes, yeah, it is. And then also my website is the website is also called skillsetcounseling.com as well. So, well, the YouTube channel is Skillset Counseling. My private practice and personal website is skillsetcounseling.com. And so, client, anybody can go there. I'm licensed in Georgia and Michigan, but I can practice telehealth in almost about 30 states right now. So there's a good chance that you may be able, to work with me if that's what you want. But anyone can book a free consultation, and we can just, if I can't help you, I'm going to try my best to find somebody that will. So that, and there are also videos on my website as well. So you'll see the resources that should be able to help you.
People, did you hear what she just said? First of all, there's a therapy crisis. Literally, it's an epidemic of its own. And she's
Yes.
literally saying free consultation, and she potentially may have virtual openings. Do what you will. But literally, I cannot tell, like, there are not many people who would open themselves up like that, and who would open up their schedules like that. So I think that is phenomenal, and I'm so grateful that you are willing to help people in that way. Well, I just want to thank you so much for this episode. I'm really looking forward to our next one, which is going to be that idea of religious OCD and religious scrupulosity. I'm going to tell you what I tell all my folks: we are with you, and God is for you.
Thank you for having me, Kyle. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, if you've listened to the whole video, thank you so much. Please continue to subscribe. If you're not a Patreon member, you're going to want to become a Patreon member so that you can get all of the content, including all of the videos and the blogs and all of that. You guys are going to love it. I'll see you next time.